Welcome everybody to our virtual panel entitled How We Move, 5 Scenarios that Test Military Mobility Across Europe. I'm retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe, now serving as the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. I'm speaking to you today from Frankfurt, Germany. Our panel today is the 4th in CEPA's monthly series on the topic of military mobility. These panels are part of our virtual military mobility workshop, which will culminate on 20 October, followed by a written report that will be published early next year. The military mobility workshop will use 5 different working groups to examine 5 scenarios that touch all over Europe. We will explore current military mobility capabilities in 5 scenarios, including moving from Norway to Estonia, moving from Western Europe through the Suwałki Corridor in Poland and Lithuania, moving from Western Europe through the Focșani Gate near the Carpathians and down into Romania, moving from Western Europe to the Western Balkans, and then finally, scenario number 5, moving from Western Europe to Libya via the Mediterranean. These 5 scenarios will drive the discussion for our military mobility workshop, which we believe will offer concrete and practical recommendations for improving the military mobility capabilities across Europe. The workshop will involve over 100 representatives and experts from all across NATO, each of the relevant agencies of the European Union and the European Parliament, several European national headquarters, multiple think tanks, relevant industries such as rail, cyber, bridging, wheeled and tracked vehicles, and air and missile defense, and also professional journalists who will be part of each of the 5 working group teams. So why does this all matter? In a potential crisis in Europe, reinforcement will rely on military mobility to move equipment and personnel across rivers, bridges, and mountains, and sometimes seas, all the while protecting critical infrastructure from cyber vulnerabilities. However, this movement is likely to occur across long distances, include multiple border crossings, and utilize the infrastructure of several different nations, and during peacetime conditions, before a crisis is officially declared. This means that our political and military leaders could face the decision to have to mobilize under peacetime conditions, which would present significant restrictions on where, when, and how forces could move. For example, military formations would be competing with commercial interests for rail cars on Deutsche Bahn cargo. How prepared is the United States and its European allies and partners for a crisis scenario which requires fast reinforcement, or where fast action might actually prevent a crisis? Today, our panel is going to look at the process, how our military mobility workshop will help us generate solutions and momentum, and perhaps it will elicit suggestions from the audience for how to do this. Let me introduce our panel now. Dr. Oliver Gnad is the co-founder and managing director of the Bureau für Zeitgeschehen, which is the Bureau of Current Affairs, a Frankfurt-based think and do tank specializing in strategic foresight and scenario planning. He is a non-resident fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States and an adjunct faculty member of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. From 2008 to 2016, he served as director of the GIZ agency, an in-house consultancy for Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, which is the German development cooperation. Miriam Ludwig is a program manager for the same Bureau of Current Affairs here in Frankfurt. Before joining the Bureau of Current Affairs as program manager, Miriam has been working for various international organizations in development cooperation. With a background in political science and sociology, and inspired by research stays in France, Poland, and the Middle East, her professional enthusiasm focuses on international relations and scenario planning. Originally from Berlin, she lives and works in Frankfurt, and I have to tell you, she is actually the brains of the Bureau, and Dr. Gnad is only a figurehead. All right, maybe that's not totally fair. Bill Robinson is going to lead the working group for our Scandinavian scenarios. So we have 5 working groups, 5 working group leaders for each of the scenarios. Bill will lead the Scandinavia scenario. He currently is the Chief of Integrated Learning of the Joint Wargaming and Experimentation Division of the Joint Staff J7 in the United States. He is a long-serving defense professional with a total of 39 years service to the United States. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry in 1981 from the University of Georgia, he served 23 years as an Army officer. Since retiring, he has served 16 years as a civilian in the Department of Defense. Some of his expertise includes establishing major knowledge management and business intelligence programs to include in Afghanistan. And he recently completed a 4-year project with a multinational capability development campaign to provide a capability for civil military data sharing. So Bill, who I've known for many years, is an expert not only in strategic thinking, but also on knowledge management and how to bring all of these things together during wargaming. Finally, our fourth panelist is our old friend, Dr. Jacek Bartosiak. Jacek will run the working group for the Suwałki Corridor scenario. Jacek is the CEO and founder of Strategy&Future, based in Warsaw, Poland. He's an expert on operational concept of modern warfare in the Central Eastern European theater, NATO's Eastern Flank, and the Western Pacific. So all four of you, thanks very much for participating today as our panelists. And I also know that each of you has done a ton of work leading up to this to help make sure that our workshop, which we'll end up conducting virtually here in October, is going to be a success. For all of our listeners, please use your Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of the screen, type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. My style for doing these things is to have a faster pace. So what we'll have is about a 3-minute answer to the questions from the panelists, and then I'll come back to them with a follow-up for about 2 minutes, and then we'll kind of move around the panel. And I would expect by about the 35-minute mark, we will start integrating questions from our audience. Oliver, first question is going to come to you. The Bureau of Current Affairs is a think tank that specializes in foresight and scenario-based strategy development. The Bureau has developed 5 scenarios for our workshop that will lay the basis for our discussion on military mobility capabilities for NATO and member countries. Before we get into the scenarios, how about explain to us, what's the value? I mean, why are we doing this? What's the value of doing a scenario-led discussion versus traditional wargaming?
Everyone, thanks, Ben, for having us. Always a pleasure working with you, and your introduction was perfectly accurate. So I'm just a water carrier here, and this is why I refine to methodological remarks. And I think it's important to make a differentiation between traditional wargaming and scenario-based exercises. A few quick remarks here. First thing is, traditional wargaming heavily relies on key assumptions based on past experiences, and very much on a fairly strict order of battle assumption. So you're going through different stages and steps of military operations as they evolve. So it's something like a pre-cooked scenario exercise, but it's not agile enough in our current environment we are in. So it follows a completely different rationale than strategic foresight, which is very much suspicious of historic precedents. And we're very suspicious about what we can learn from history or historical experience. So instead of relying on patterns of the past or pre-cooked scenarios, yes, we do pre-cooking to a certain extent, but we look at this from a different angle. Strategic foresighters aim at navigating what we call the terra incognita, the unknown territory. So we try to play with as many assumptions and plausible emerging futures as we can possibly think of. A, to raise awareness about nonlinear and counterintuitive developments, stuff we have not yet seen in the past. And B, and this is obvious, to improve preparedness for a terra incognita world we are heading towards. So we are more interested in theaters of war or operation where no historical blueprints are available, because they very often are pitfalls for adequate planning. So we want to raise awareness about emerging patterns, weak signals of change, how new actors, new technologies, new challenges, and particularly new mindsets change preparedness in the security and military realm. So it's about thinking the unthinkable, as Herman Kahn would have put it already 70 years ago, right? So after all, military planning is about preparedness for the unknown and not for the known. So what we aim at is a new strategic mindset, a mental openness for the unknown, and to be prepared for whatever future situation may arise. So that's for the kickoff.
Yeah, thanks for that. So what is the what's the key to run a working group like this? I've participated in a couple of the workshops that you've run before on different topics, and they're intense, they're sophisticated, and they do elicit a wide range of. In fact, they help force us to get out of comfort zones. So that's the reason we wanted you to help to organize this workshop for us, the scenarios. But you've got two working group leaders here, Bill Robinson and Jacek Bartosiak. What do they need to know using this kind of style? What would be a couple of keys for a work group leader, especially when everybody in their working group are coming from multiple organizations, multiple countries, and now because of the COVID, it's all going to be done virtual. What advice do you have for Bill and for Jacek?
So working with scenarios is, to a certain extent, it's a dilemma, because yet you need a whole complexity or multiplicity of divergent people and knowledge. Heterogeneity is key, because the more you look into the weak signals, the more expertise you have at the table, or a sensitivity for change. And yet experts are needed, because what we're talking about is highly differentiated stuff. It is technical stuff. We really need to know what you're talking about. But experts are not always helpful, because they tend to replicate their known knowns, the stuff they have experienced in the past. I was just hinting at that. And yet they need to be open for a completely new environment, and probably public mindsets or developments which they have not yet seen in practice. So it is, to a certain extent, overcoming a dilemma between heterogeneity and multiplicity of views, and yet being able to project this expertise into a future environment nobody has yet seen. So it's very much about the moderation skills of those moderators and workshop group leaders. Great,
thanks. And Bill and Jacek, both of you, when I come to you here in a couple of minutes, you know, you've got a chance to ask the architect of victory here, Dr. Gnad, you know, for some advice on how do you drag your cyber guy into it, your bridge guy, or whatever. Miriam, let me come to you. As I was only half joking at the beginning, I know that you're the mastermind behind these 5 scenarios. You did all the work and helped develop the product. Other than us giving you, hey, here's the 5 scenarios we'd like to look at. I mean, you pretty much did all of it. What were the guiding principles that you used to develop the scenarios? And other than me asking for 5, I mean, what's the advantage of using like multiple scenarios instead of just, you know?
Yeah, let me answer your second question first, maybe, because this refers to the methodological approach that my colleague Oliver just outlined. So scenarios help us to bridge the gap between our linear mindset. So we are only able to anticipate linear developments. This is very human, but also very limited, as he pointed out. So the scenarios therefore help us to open up a space for alternative futures, as we put it. And we anticipate in the scenarios today's weak signals to create a minimum of preparedness for a completely different but highly plausible setting. And these plausible but highly different settings are our 5 scenarios. So we try to anticipate like very different, specific issues and to demonstrate that there are alternative futures. There's not this very linear thinking, but we are like operating in a field where we don't know where it really goes. So we need to think in alternative ways. And the 5 scenarios reflect on 5 highly sensitive geostrategic regions for European security. And in the upcoming CEPA workshop, as you said it, these regions' capabilities for military mobility will be tested. And as you said already, this includes like the transport routes from Norway to Estonia, Western Europe to the Suwałki Corridor, the Focșani Gate, the Western Balkans, and in the last case, Libya via the Mediterranean. And all 5 scenarios follow some key characteristics, as you were asking for the guiding principles. And they intend to demonstrate readiness under time pressure in peacetime conditions, except for the scenario 5, Libya, which we will look at closer in a few minutes. And the scenario also have in common that they presume a 7 days notice to move, and they are based on a complex multimodal mode of transport. That sounds very complicated, but it means that it considers shifting equipment from, for example, waterways to roads and railways. And the overall intention of those scenarios is to generate concrete recommendations for different actors, may they be political or like military institutions or like other kind of people involved. And those recommendations are designed to improve military mobility across Europe. And the second point is that the scenarios want to raise awareness for the importance of this issue. And the third thing is to generate a sense of urgency. Yeah, that is what they all have in common and was very important for the scenarios development.
Miriam, thanks. One of the tools that you've provided for the each of the 5 working groups was something that we called the 20 questions. What are the 20 questions about, and how do you sort of envision the work group leaders using them?
Yeah, so we actually did 4 steps to develop the scenarios, and I might outline that a little to understand what we did, because first of all, we designed the 5 regions that are of the fundamental strategic importance. Then we will come to that closer probably when we talk with the working group leaders. Then we assumed a specific setting that demands moving the military equipment to the regions. And then we thoroughly analyzed existing data on infrastructure in those regions, mainly from the European Union, like the European Transport Network, but also from national ministries that provide data on railways, main streets, highways, ports, and so on. And the last thing that we did is that we developed the multimodal modes of transport. So they basically consider reinforcement by sea and then continuing either on roads or on railway lines and rivers. And there we have like the shifting equipment from one way of transportation to another in mind. And this goes, and those settings are very different, but they all go along with the same challenges. And those are the things that are going to be discussed by the experts in the working groups. And to give them some kind of framework in which to work on, because time is always limited. And Oliver already mentioned the challenges that we cope with in those workshop settings. And we develop a questionnaire of, like at the moment, 20 questions, but they cover 4 categories. And I would like to mention them shortly, because I think that's very important in order to understand what we want to have as an outcome. The 4 categories are dealing with legal and diplomatic standards, managing the infrastructural requirements and standards, and chains of command and communication. And the 4th one is anticipating risks of security. But probably the most interesting thing is defining the priorities of action. And in the end, this is like the main outcome, I think. And this is what we call the framework of this whole setting during those days. And something that we can have like key takeaways that we can continue to work with like after the workshop also.
That's perfect. And you're exactly right. What the key outcomes in terms of specifics is for each of the working groups to recommend priorities for whether it's the nations or European Union, Commission, Parliament, or NATO to jump on. Okay, thank you for that. How about let's now that we've explained the process a little bit, each of the working groups will have upwards of 20 to 25 people from multiple agencies across the European Union or from the European Parliament, from European EU military staff, various NATO organizations at SHAPE, national headquarters. I mentioned that we'll have defense industry reps, so you have bridge expertise, wheeled vehicle expertise, seaport expertise, but also cyber expertise, air and missile defense, and also have journalists that will be not just watching, but actually in each of the 5 working groups to kind of be able to, for their own understanding, but also to explain to their audiences, their readers and viewers, what this is all about. Let's talk about Libya for just a minute. I think I saw 5 different articles or reports on Libya just this morning alone, whether it was about airstrikes or drones or Turkish vessels, Russian Air Force, General Haftar, you name it. And clearly, this is an increasingly important area. And we've even seen that Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, head of the Munich Security Conference, has indicated that it might be time for the European Union to put boots on the ground in Libya. So let's talk about this scenario. Oliver, what was the thinking behind this? I mean, what's your vision for what a Libya scenario, how will that help us address military mobility?
Thanks, Ben, for the question. Before I answer, let me quickly say, I think the way how we see this debate emerging right now, particularly in Germany, is not the way how you want to structure or kick off a strategic debate in a society. And we've not learned much in Germany about how to build a strategic thinking environment and to prepare a population and a political landscape for playing a different role in the neighborhood when it comes to security, military security, than in the past. Having said that, let me throw out how we came across that, Ben, and we were both instrumental in thinking this way. It's more than a year ago that we did a scenario workshop in Bucharest, near Bucharest, in Constanta. It was about the Black Sea region as a new strategic environment and how can we anticipate non-linear projections in military threats. And we came up with the Russian role in not only in the Black Sea, but also in the Eastern and the Western Mediterranean. And we just projected a weak signal into the future, say, if we take a weak signal seriously, that Russia is aiming at widening its base structure throughout the world. We just read about submarines in the North Atlantic today, and Bill, you come back on this later on. If you see weak signals of change of strategic behavior of the Russians, the next logical step was to establish a naval base in Libya or the northern coast of Africa, because this is the missing spot to go all the way through the Atlantic at the Gibraltar Strait. So this was the precursor for our thinking when we developed the mobility scenarios. Okay, let us play it around a bit with a weak signal. What if? It's a what if scenario. Can we think it to the end and are we prepared? Or would this be a different kind of theater we need to prepare for differently? And yes, this is a different kind of theater because it is non-NATO territory. It is non-EU partnership countries. We have to completely rethink our diplomatic tools, our logistic tools. So it's a non-linear, it's a surprise event we're not prepared for as European Union, probably as NATO. We've done these kind of operations in the past, but from a public mindset, from the readiness of the political class and the structures in place, even through PESCO or NATO, we are not yet there. So to do that kind of exercises is very helpful in not be overtaken by surprise, but always be ahead of the curve as strategic or military threats evolve.
Thanks for that. I do remember when you first brought up a possibility of a Russian base in Libya over a year ago. I thought you were crazy. I didn't even cross my mind, and here you're exactly right. And so I think the scenario will be a fun one to work on. And I was in Switzerland back in January at another conference, and I had a chance to talk to one of the security officials there, and they said the idea of moving military convoys through Switzerland to go to Italy, say to move to a port for transit across Mediterranean, they have very, very strict laws about what they can and cannot do. And so that's part of what this is all about, why we wanted to address this scenario, so that we can help identify what would have to be done if, whether it was an EU mission or a French-led or Italian-led military mission, to go over into Libya. I've got a bunch of questions are already coming in. I'm going to dip into our audience questions real quick and come right to you, Miriam. This question is from our friend Ambassador Timo Koster, who is one of the leading voices on military mobility in Europe. He says he would like to ask Miriam about the 7 days notice to move that you talked about in the scenarios. Where'd that come from?
I was unmuted, sorry. Yeah, this is an assumption that we had in the beginning to somehow make the scenario similar in its like framework setting. And we had a huge discussion about that. So it's very interesting that this point is again mentioned. So we had a meeting in February where we're talking about the 7 days. So what exactly is day one? It's more or less like to create a similar framework and to demonstrate that there's time pressure in that. So this is the reason why we have it.
Thanks. Yeah, I remember, I think Colonel Brandeis from Joint Sustainment Enabling Command in Ulm is the one that helped draw our attention to that. Okay, let's go to Bill. Let's talk about your scenario. You're responsible for leading the scenario up in Scandinavia, moving convoys and equipment from Norway all the way to Estonia. Why does this scenario matter? I mean, why is this one? Why is it worth taking on this particular scenario?
Ben, thank you very much, and I appreciate being a part of this. Well, for me personally, it means a lot in two ways. One, it helps us to really consider the North American perspective on mobility. For the United States, we have to do a strategic deployment in order to begin the operational deployment. And by that, I mean we must cross the North Atlantic. And as Dr. Gnad mentioned, there's just yesterday was increased Russian submarine activity there. But the other part of that is we also know the Russians have increased their ability to very quickly, at least attempt, to dominate the Baltic. We've, over the last 2 years, seen a lot of aggressive use of submarines and submersibles. They have a very strong missile defense and offensive missile capability. And of course, the further east we go, the stronger their ability to deploy air power becomes. So we can't assume that we can use the straits to go from the North Atlantic into the Baltic. So when you combine those two things, to do a credible deterrence, we have to be able to show we can still bring forces in from the US, from Canada, into the Baltic. Well, and for that matter, the UK, if they chose to do it. But underlying all that, I would also add that we use the term in the United States, globally integrated operations, and we also in the US and NATO talk about multi-domain or all-domain operations. We know the Russians are very prepared during competition to disrupt all aspects of the information domains through cyber warfare, et cetera, to try to keep us from deploying. So that are sort of the two broad. One, that we can't assume that when the forces leave and start their movement, the sea lines won't quickly become contested. And second, that there will be an increasing amount of cyber and other information domination or disruption that tries to prevent an effective deployment of forces into theater. Then the final part of that is what we might call the in-stride diplomacy that will be required. While the Russian aggression in the Baltics, their demonstration of power has certainly increased partnership between Sweden and Finland in the Baltic. The fact remains we would have to, just like Switzerland, get them to make specific decisions and changes to actually allow the deployment of forces either from Western ports to Eastern ports or up around if it became so contested by air or sea.
Let me ask about this. Your scenario is very unique, which is part of the reason I like it, because it does involve movement through Sweden and across the Baltic Sea somehow, which is likely to be contested. Tell me about your working group. Who do you have? What kind of expertise do you think you'll have in your working group based on all the different people that have volunteered for it? And what's your expectation of them?
Well, the three that I would like to highlight is one, that we have political expertise. Political expertise is going to be critical to this one. Understanding, what are the trigger points where we can expect to see increased cooperation from the Swedes especially. The second part is cyber. As I mentioned, I expect that there will be an extraordinary amount of gray area warfare that just pushes against the line of competition to conflict, because we've seen how far they will go with cyber warfare. And the final expertise that I think is useful is that we have expertise in ports. Getting people on and off the ships is critical to this. If we do transition if the Russians were to try to disrupt us and switch from competition to conflict, we have to be prepared to defend the ports, get through the ports from the minute we begin the deployment.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching that particular scenario, and I think the fact that Sweden put troops back on Gotland Island tells you that they view the threat as being real there.
And the reestablishing selective service.
Yeah, no kidding. Miriam, interesting. I've seen multiple questions coming back about notice to move again. Our friend Hans Dahmen, of course, who will lead our Libya scenario, is talking about it. and Timo Koster had also followed up. He talked about, have you considered using the notice to effect metric, as that is probably even more relevant in collective defense scenarios? Did we or what discussions did we have about notice to effect versus notice to move, and how do you think, as you and Oliver design scenarios, how would we expect the working groups to take that on?
We didn't actually talk about the notice to effect as far as I remember. So we have the notice to move, as I said already, to create the time pressure, to not maybe distance the core work in the groups too much from the actual task. And I think this is something that we can say from our experience, that this is always quite a risk when you have many people, experts from different perspectives in one room. Again, is there an open part of your question, Ben? Sorry.
No, part of what we wanted to accomplish today was to elicit ideas and recommendations from the audience, exactly like that, because this will be a question. It has always perplexed me when I hear notice to move. Does that mean from when you get the order, you then have 7 days to begin to be there, or 7 days before the first vehicle has to be ready to move? And then, of course, if you have notice to effect, that actually for political leaders and senior leaders, I think is going to be the most important, is when am I going to start seeing the result of this big decision we've made. So I think what we'll want to do, of course, is build into the process for the working group leaders. How do they incorporate? Because inevitably that'll come up in the discussion, don't you think?
And I think the advice in that regard would be to remain a little flexible in the groups. Like, of course, like this 7 days can be adapted. Like, I mean, it really depends what is going to be moved. Like, we had this generic convoy as an idea, but also it depends on the transport route in your specific scenario. So if you feel that you would need to adapt that, you have the flexibility to do that.
Got it. Okay, Jacek. You know, I've known you now for a few years, and you've become an expert on transportation as well as strategic thinking, and the relationship between the two. And Poland, of course, sits right in the middle. Whether the alliance were to respond to a crisis or try to prevent a crisis in the Baltics, or even down into southeastern Europe, Poland sits in the middle of all that. I think you just recently did a reconnaissance of the Suwałki Corridor area, or you were planning to. Have you done that, or what's your reconnaissance plan?
Yes. Hi, hello everybody. Thank you for having me here at this panel. I'm in the middle of this reconnaissance. I was just belatedly checking in to the panel because I was running on the rest of my fuel to get to my Riga's dwelling. Where I'm sitting now, and I've on my own skin I witnessed how long a stretch it is to get through the Suwałki Corridor to Riga, which in my personal opinion is the center of gravity in the Baltic states in terms of the real fighting, right through sort of, you know, the main operational axis if Russians decided to invade. So I'm right in Riga. All day long we were, you know, checking the connectivity here from Poland. Yesterday was the same. Yesterday we spent all day in the area between Pisz, between Olecko in Poland, and Hodges, where the US troops are rotating, and the Białystok and the Belarusian border, and moving all those stretches of highways and motorways that connect to Lithuania, checking which are viable, which are not. I have my, you know, new ideas, new thinking. We were checking on the real maneuvering. We were talking to the local people, whether they see troops checking things, whether they see Polish and US troops checking in main crossroads, main bridges. We checked actually all bridges yesterday that allow connectivity from Poland into Lithuania. And then the critical line of the Nemunas River that separates Lithuania into two parts. And these are critical crossings, and there are not so many of them. And it also boils down to the key operational decisions that need to be made by commanders in the field, which way to go. And that will trigger serious implications for the political. You know, we can go into details, you know, because we have those flanking positions. We were checking on the railway renovations and so on and so forth. So we are in the middle, my team and myself, we are in the middle of checking the terrain tool. Certain things are being upgraded, certain things are being thought over properly, but still it's a long stretch to project power from Poland into Tallinn, not to mention Tartu, Voru, Narva, and many distant places, okay? And the geography is also very complex. In Lithuania, for example, south of the Nemunas River, is a perfect tank terrain. And our NATO operational line, strategic line of communication to the north, is exposed from the left, very much, from the Kaliningrad. So we need to address it politically as well in terms of the escalation ladder, what sort of answer we have, what procedures we have. We need to simulate it. We do it as strategy and future. We involve some political simulation, how politicians behave within the alliance that have so many members. And there are, of course, conflicting interests, and the perception of threat is mitigated by distance, for example, from the hot flashpoint. So we try to put it into the perspective And you were perfectly right many times when you were saying, and I felt it in my own skin. Speed is the essence. Speed of understanding, recognition, decision, and then committing, and then commuting along this connectivity venue. So it's critically important. There are, I think, many issues to catch up with.
Jacek, thanks. I am so impressed that you actually are out actually doing a reconnaissance of this area, and I mean, I can feel it or hear it in your voice that you must have been on horseback out doing this reconnaissance. some long days. So a couple of questions. Our friend Dr. Stephanie Fry, who was a cyber expert who I met in Switzerland several months ago, she's asking about what measures are taken to reduce the vulnerability to a cyber attack that would hamper deployment. What did you see on your reconnaissance where?
Very good question. For example, we talked to some local people from the railway in Poland, connecting to Lithuania along the Suwałki Corridor main axis, that the Russians employed both allegedly employed. I need to check it, verify both cyber and electromagnetic spectrum to spoof and then jam the railway signal that commands and control the railway flows. Okay, and they did it effectively last year. Okay, infringing on and breaching the system. So these are the threats that are, in the air. I mean, we can face it. But there are many other issues regarding cyber that may hinder proper speed and connectivity in the region as well. So I think it's a full bag of issues and problems that we need to face: geography, political cohesion, escalation ladder, troops, low density of troops, the flanking positions, and how to address those issues. When you need to establish a safe strategic line of communication, and your flanks are exposed both politically and militarily, and and that puts a lot of pressure on the cohesion of the alliance. And Poland, as you said, is the center of gravity here because it will be on our shoulders, and I can assure you that we are thinking. And I would like, in my scenario, I would like to focus my effort to properly think it through, how to create the proper cohesion of understanding, because this is politically the center of gravity where our adversaries would try to strike, okay, to make a rift in our cohesion by using the advantages, the different kinds of cyber, geography, the local advantage, numbers, or many other aspects. So this is the critically important point. That's why I wanted to check it in my own eyes right prior to the workshop, before we do it, because then I have my skin in the game. I can feel it, I understand it. I see the rivers, I see the crossings, and it's always better, to be there and understand.
Thanks for doing that. Miriam, any questions for Jacek? You designed the scenario, and he went out and did reconnaissance for you. Have you heard anything where you would want to fine tune, or you have a question for
him? I find it very interesting that, Jacek, that you said it's about the cohesion of understanding, because I think that's a very important point when we talk about, I saw that again in the asked questions about the notice to move, because I think it's a very important thing to have a specific focus within your scenario, and you demonstrated that very well. And I think that can be an advice for the other working group leaders as well. So thanks for stressing that.
Thank you very much.
And again, for all of our scenarios, working group leaders will have a lot of flexibility to modify and adjust and adapt as we learn more, as more and more experts begin to pile on, just like this. By the way, I've seen another question on cyber. We did a good panel last month on cyber protection of infrastructure. So for any of you in our audience that are listening now that want to hear more, that panel from June is recorded and at CEPA's website. If you'd like to hear what we had three very good experts to talk about cyber protection of infrastructure and what needs to be done, including the head of the NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence from Estonia and the former Lithuanian Deputy Defense Minister who was responsible for cyber. I'm looking at a good question here from this is from Heiner Braus, of course. Heiner is one of the mentors for our workshop, and he highlights again this issue of the notice to move. And I think what we'll need to do, Oliver and Miriam, is think through, because these are not all NATO scenarios that we're talking about. And of course, for the workshop, the purpose of the workshop is to find what are all the obstacles, the challenges, things that inhibit military mobility. And so I do remember that we selected the 7 days notice to move as sort of the standard for each of the 5 scenarios. But I think the working group leaders, we could probably provide a little bit more fidelity for each of them on that particular thing, or open it up for their efforts. I have a question from an anonymous attendee asking, what is going to be the output from the working groups? Is there going to be a culminating paper? Great question. Yes, there will be a paper. Professor Julian Lindenfridge will compile the output from all 5 working groups beginning in October, and then that'll get printed or that will be published early in the new year. And frankly, the reason we're delaying until early in the new year is, I mean, there's a US presidential election, I think, that will blow most other things off the news. And we didn't want our written report to be lost in the smoke and dust and noise of what could be a pretty interesting presidential election. So we also thought it would help kickstart the new year as people emerge from their COVID caves, and to regenerate momentum and interest. So there will be a written report. But what we will do for the actual virtual workshop, since it is going to be virtual now instead of an in-person event in Brussels as originally envisioned, is we'll have journalists embedded in all 5 working groups. So there will be opportunities for live streaming during some of those, the workshops themselves. And then, of course, on the 20th of October will be the actual presentation where representatives of each of the 5 working groups will present to a couple of senior, a panel with a couple of very senior people on it, the key findings based on the 20 questions and what they did. And as Miriam laid out earlier, our 3 objectives for the workshop are to generate specific, achievable objectives with priorities, to raise awareness, and of course to generate momentum. And that's the reason for having media embedded in everything that we're doing. Now, here's a question that's it's about the Balkans, and we don't have Greg Melcher participating today. He's running the Balkans discussion, but I think that Jacek, you may be able to help us answer this one. This is from Colonel J.C. Lensnick. For the Balkans discussion, how do you see the mini Schengen assisting speed of assembly? How could Serbia maintain its stance of non-alignment, military neutrality, and would that impact NATO? So Jacek, I'd like you to take a crack at that. And then Oliver, I know you've got a lot of expertise and pay close attention to the Western Balkans. I'll come to you as well. So this idea of a mini Schengen, does that help or hurt? And how do we think Serbia will react? Jacek.
You know, but again, the perfect question. I mean, mini Schengen would be of great assistance to move troops and signal capabilities, in this way deterring potential aggression as well. But it will be hardly derivable because of Serbia, because of many other factors in the Balkans, including China and including, of course, the Russian influence, and including many others resulting from a sort of, I would call it remoteness from the core area of the political life of both European Union and NATO, so to speak. Okay, I can draw some conclusions also from from flexible response posture in Romania, for many decision makers across the Atlantic and also in Brussels or in Western Europe. It's really far away. Okay, and these are distant matters of lesser importance. That's why the political cohesion and the political message is critically important. And that, of course, touches on other issues on military ability and more profound, structurally profound in terms of the future of Europe per se. Okay.
Oliver.
I just want to underline what Jacek just hinted. I mean, the one thing is you start your wargaming with key assumptions, and they are political and they are on paper. But once a crisis erupts and we're in real life, you really have to be flexible and agile as the situation evolves. So you need to play with different assumptions and play through different war games as the crisis evolves. And this is why we say it's not that you can put a scenario in place and think this through on a paper situation. Depending on the dynamic, the political circumstances, and the crisis itself, it is so important to have the political mindset and the perception of the population and the political class in place here. So what Jacek hinted at earlier, it is not sufficient to have a military logistic exercise in place. So this is a necessity we have to do. But at the same time, we have to become more political in raising awareness in political classes throughout Europe. Start developing a common lexicon on what do we actually talk about, what are the options, and what can we do to be prepared before a crisis emerges. And this is a completely different layer, and this also applies to the Balkans, or even more so, as we have seen in the last 30 years, that this is a highly dynamic geopolitical space.
Without a really great transportation infrastructure, by the way, as well. Bill, I'm going to double up on you here. Two good questions that are practical questions that you'll have to address in your scenario, as will the others. The first of the two is from Marta Kepi, who has done a lot of research on the subject herself. It's fuel supply is vitally important. How do the scenarios integrate fuel supply and energy security? So that's the first part. And then the second question is from Stuart Gregory. What assumptions are you going to make about strategic lift capacity within the scenario? Bill.
Those are really good questions. First, on the fuel matter, I've been thinking about that one in particular, because while we hope that we'll be able to get as much fuel as possible in theater, we also have to be prepared to immediately start the logistics surge from North America, which again, comes out of the Great Lakes and comes down the Mississippi River, not just through the eastern ports. The second part of that is, how do we work with nations, like you mentioned, that we don't have a in-depth distribution set up to the extent we even have with NATO, to make sure we can distribute our fuel? Do we have to use offsets? The final part of that is in terms of the energy security, that's going to be completely overlapped with the cyber warfare. We've seen that as the biggest threat to our ability to operate our energy, is even now increasing attempts to test our cybersecurity of our energy infrastructure. As far as the lift capacity, that's a lesson I personally learned way back when we did operations in Haiti in the mid-90s, that just to get forces from the Great Lakes down through New York and then down to Haiti, which we did with the 10th Mountain Division, even using an aircraft carrier, which is a lot faster than a commercial vessel, it took us 10 days to load, get them over there and unload them. We have to look at sea lift not just as the number of hulls, but we have to look at the efficiency of the system. You know, and the European nations have done some really great work with that. But we've got to achieve that operational speed for what we used to call in the old days, fort to fight, if you recall, where we have to figure out what's the capacity of the system. So my assumption is that we will be in the process of converting from a peacetime to a mobilized sea lift capacity. So I don't expect full sea lift available. I expect us to have about 50% of wartime capacity.
So here's a couple of questions from our friend Peter Borisov. Both of them are related to Ukraine. Jacek, I want to give you the first crack at this. It's about first with Ukraine now as of course has just been elevated to special partner status with the alliance. But that doesn't mean that we have a requirement to, obviously, if they're attacked, there's not a NATO Article 5 requirement. But nonetheless, there are American soldiers in Ukraine, there are Canadian soldiers in Ukraine, there are British soldiers and sailors in Ukraine. There are other allies that are there helping Ukraine. So military mobility regarding Ukraine does matter. And it also matters trying to get around or through the Carpathians to get into Romania. What would you expect, or what are some things that would help improve military mobility with regards to Ukraine, whether to get to it or through it?
Okay, it's always tricky to ask a Pole about Ukraine in terms of geopolitical interests. Okay, and we have here a few important caveats that I need to make. First of all, for Poland, it's difficult to sort of grasp the strategic implications of the issue that you just raised. Of course, Ukraine is not in NATO, but for Poland, it's of critical strategic importance. It's a pivot. Poland and Ukraine monopolizes strategic flows across the northern European plains. So historically, it used to be critically important also for Germany. And it will be for the European Union if the European Union evolves into a more coherent entity. The Carpathians create a condition that in order to be properly connected to Romania and make a hub, an internal line of communication between Poland and Romania that will counter the Russian sort of negotiation through the new generation warfare tools, it will embrace Ukraine, okay, because you get connected to Romania and Black Sea through Western Ukraine. And, it's in Polish national interest to have it. So we have been planning a lot of stuff there. We have been planning to have highways and a railway connecting to Constanța across the Western Ukraine. And if we had enough money and enough political support in the European Union and NATO, we would have done it already, okay? It's more important than many other projects that are happening. And that's why we create Solidarity Transport Hub design to create a proper connectivity, north-south, not only east-west, okay? And that would create the internal line of communication between the Black Sea and the North and the Baltic Sea. And with Ukraine existing independently from Russia, that creates quite a problem for Russians to project power and demonstrate any capabilities along the external lines of communications of their land empire when they are undermanned, underskilled, and they have problem with financial resources. And for peacetime, that would be a very good move to deter by showing the force, by using the proper transportation connectivity.
Thanks, Jacek. I was thinking of you as a working group leader, not as a Pole. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but you handled it perfectly. Okay, look, we're up against the end of it here. I always like to conclude with a lightning round where each of you gets 1 minute to make that one last point that you didn't get to make, or that you want to reinforce something, or whatever it is, but we got 1 minute to kind of wrap things up. So we'll go in the same sequence. Oliver, Miriam, Bill, and Jacek. Go.
Thanks, Ben. So my key takeaway from today is that we even have to be more ambitious in our exercise. It is a must to have the military logistics in place and do those exercises on a continuous basis. It's not a one-off. There need to be a process continuing as we go and evolve and improve. But what is most important is to kickstart a civil military discourse throughout Europe to raise the awareness and to be prepared not only on the national level, but also on the subnational level, because the interlinkages and the handover points would be decisive in guaranteeing military mobility.
Thanks, Oliver. You and Miriam, what a great team. I'm really grateful for the work y'all have done in this. All right, Miriam, lightning round, go.
Maybe because we are a great team, I would step into the same direction as Oliver, because that was my thought too, like to put it in the broader context. He already said that it's not like a military mobility exercise per se, but it has so many interlinkages to so many other different and very, very important topics. Jacek mentioned the political will and so on. And I think it's a very, very great possibility to raise the awareness in political classes and being better prepared for the future, and making use of the possibility to ask the questions that will become very, very important, and to have that opportunity that now, like this year or the next year, and maybe continue follow-up process is a very big chance, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you and Oliver probably got some good ideas from listening to some of the questions, you know, the questions about cyber, about fuel supply, about the infrastructure. As I'm looking at the list of all the people that are listening in today, I see bridge expertise, I see wheeled vehicle expertise as well. So, and then of course the issue about the timing, the notice to move, notice to effect. We may want to, I think it'd be appropriate to revisit that a little bit and help the group leaders. Okay, Battling Bill Robinson.
Okay, well, the one thing I would like to mention is information. We've talked a lot about cyber and our ability to defend and attack, but we also have to think of our ability to use and especially exploit information. And that means we have to be able to share information. If we're going to effectively share information, we have to think about the civ-mil aspect of it. And we traditionally talk about civ-mil, we think about diplomatic relations or disaster response, things like that. But we have to think very hard about how do we share information to support strategic and operational mobility. And that means data across boundaries we really aren't good at. We still struggle sometimes with multinational information sharing. We have to learn to do sharing with the transportation networks, with the civil population, with the tactical level coordination of movements, et cetera. So I would ask that everybody look at information, data, and knowledge sharing across the civ-mil boundaries to support mobility.
A terrific point. You reminded me that about 95% of all the mobility is going to be executed by civilian vendors, contractors, Deutsche Bahn Cargo, trucks that we hired, ships that are all commercial. These are not military. And so they don't have CEPA, they won't have a classified network. So we've got to figure out how do you communicate across all these different domains with host nation support as you go. And for sure, as Stephanie Fry reminded us, all of that's going to be under attack from somebody that's trying to disrupt our efforts. So I look forward to each of the working groups taking this on. Okay, Jacek, Dr. Bartosiak from Riga now, in the middle of your reconnaissance lightning round, go.
Okay, I think that in the coming months and years, we will be facing a more chaotic and more wilder environment, strategic environment, emanating from inner Eurasia, both from Russia and China, And that will put a lot of pressure on the Eastern Mediterranean, on the Black Sea, on the Levant, and also on the Northern European plain. So we're going to have a lot of exercises, planning, simulations, and we need to develop this strategic culture that sort of expired or was quelled over the last 30 years of this peace dividend of peace. Okay, after the Cold War, it's going to change now. So let's get ready for that.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. There was one question that we didn't get to that I really wanted, but it was not appropriate for the specific topic today. And it was from a gentleman that asked, is it likely that Russia will attempt a land grab during the Kafkas exercise in September? And there has been a lot of talk about the possibility of that because of the water shortage in Crimea, disinformation operations there. Maybe the U.S. is distracted. So I don't know. But CEPA will take this on next week. Brian Whitmore, my CEPA colleague who runs the excellent Power Vertical podcast, will organize a discussion to talk about that very possibility. And CEPA, of course, will be advertising that. So all four of you guys, thanks so much. I'm even more motivated about the workshop and the level of sophistication that Oliver, you and Miriam have put into it, and then seeing the expertise and effort by the Bill and Jacek, and I know that Dr. Phil Peterson and Greg Melcher and Hans Dahmen, our other three work group leaders, are at the same level of preparation. So thanks very much. And all of you, thanks very much for listening in, and let's get moving. Thank you.